Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks to the organizers and to all of you for being here and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this work and what I've been thinking about. I'm relatively new to the Truthmaker Semantics world. So I've only been working on this in the past months, but I would be very excited to hear your thoughts and reactions and feedback. So today I will be speaking about invariances, and it's widespread in logic, like for people to think about invariance conditions for a given sort of semantics or models. For example, we have set theoretic isomorphism in first order logic. In modal logic, we have bisimulations and variance thereof between possible world models, or topo bisimulations between topological models, neighborhood semantics. In category theory, there's equivalence of categories that demonstrates this general direction of thinking. And in fact, this invariance-based thinking is widespread in other domains like mathematics and physics, where in fact it also attracts a lot of philosophical attention for good or bad reasons. However, it seems that in the relatively young literature on Truthmaker Semantics, we haven't seen an explicit taking on this sort of invariance-based reasoning. And in fact, sometimes the way people introduce the framework seems to give the wrong impression that it presupposes an ultimate, like a single carving of the world into states that excludes any other alternative state spaces from which a state space could be a variant of, related to, in a way that actually does the same semantic work. And in fact, I was thinking that people who are more suspicious towards the framework often find that reasons for being true, or like introducing states as fact-like entities that are aspects of the world, they find this like too metaphysical for their tastes. And in fact, they consider the framework to be just logic for metaphysicians. I'm not naming names about the skeptics who have expressed these views to me, but I want to say that this is a wrong impression to get. And in fact, the framework is semantics in the logician sense, and not something like D.M. Armstrong's Truthmakers that amounts to an attempt to pinpoint the ultimate constituents of reality. But rather, we are trying to explicate, to formally account for fine-grained ascriptions of truth and content in logic and natural language and so on. So I was thinking that an entry point towards starting to enrich Truthmaker semantics and the relevant ways of thinking with this invariance-based direction would be to seek a precise criterion for when two apparently distinct Truthmaker models would verify and falsify the same formulas of a given language. And of course, I mean at a point in the manner of two pointed Truthmaker models. Having such a criterion also enables us to reason about expressiveness, because if we had such a criterion and we found two models that satisfied it, but one of them had property P and the other didn't have the property P, that would amount to a demonstration that we cannot actually have a formula of that interpreted language that could define that property P. So here's the question that I will undertake in this presentation and in my project more generally. what it would take for two states, S and S prime, in distinct or apparently distinct truthmaker models, M and M prime, to verify and falsify exactly the same formulas of a given language. My starting point is a connection to modal logic, but of a different sort than the ones we've seen so far today. And a reason for that is that modal logics are characterized by invariance under some variant of bisimulation, as I mentioned before. So bisimilar models satisfy the same model formulas, that is, they are representations of the same model structure. And there are variants of bisimulation that work with different varieties of modal logic. But the most general one is the one I've listed here, which consists of an atomic harmony clause that says that the two bisimilar pointed models must satisfy the same atomic statements, and two back and forth conditions. The first tells us that if we have two bisimilar states and we take the successor of one of them, then there must be a successor of the other that is bisimilar to that successor. And the fourth condition tells us that this should go also from the second model to the first, back and forth. That's an example of two bisimilar models that where bisimulation is in blue, and we have the satisfaction of the same model formulas in both models. So the reason why I bring this up is because there has been a translation proposed by Johann van Bentham and elaborated by Søren Knudstorp that effectively turns a truthmaker model into a possible world model of the so-called modal information logic. So this is a modal logic that was proposed by van Bentham himself that takes possible worlds, or what we ordinarily call possible worlds of a Kripke model, to be information states, and takes a three-place accessibility relation as its modality that amounts to a supremum modality. So the translation that van Bentham has offered maps each propositional letter P to two new propositional letters, P plus and P minus, which is, of course, an echo of the Van Frassen paper from the late 60s that is kind of a precursor of Truthmaker Semantics, and then has these recursive clauses that directly translate truthmaker, the verification of a truthmaker conjunction into the holding of this supremum diamond modality between two statements, and respectively for the falsification of a disjunction. So, given this translation, and given that model information logic is itself invariant under a strong variety of bisimulation that preserves suprema, it's worth asking ourselves whether we could actually take the same notion and use it as an invariance criterion for truthmaker models. After all, translations like van Bentham's in logic usually enable the transfer of proof techniques and results from one domain to the other. Unfortunately, things are not that simple. First of all, it's worth realizing that the van Bentham translation takes a propositional language interpreted via truthmaker semantics into a so-called positive fragment of classical model languages. These sorts of positive fragments have received increased attention in the later years, mainly because they are simpler and they enable reasoning about decidability and other things. But to do so, as we noticed, we had to introduce new propositional letters. We had to change the language. And for every P, we have now P plus and P minus. And this was the way to make the hyperintentionality of verification and falsification actually mesh with classical negation. Relatedly, this is a translation in only one way. We go from truthmaker models to the models of model information logic, but not back. And in fact, this is unsurprising because there is information about classical possible world models of model languages that cannot be embedded in the truthmaker models. Decidability proves to be an example of that. For example, we have had proofs by Fine and Jago and Knudstorp that varieties of truthmaker entailment are decidable. And this is not just because of non-classical negation, because in recent work, Søren Knudstorp in Amsterdam has shown that logics like that have a strong non-classical flavor, like bunched implication logics that were thought to be decidable or not. So in a sense, we actually have much more in the possible world's classical side. And this is also reflected in the proof techniques that are usually used to prove a by simulation invariance result. For example, to prove such a result, one of the things we need to do is showing that if two states S and T satisfy the same model formulas, then there must be a pair of their successors, according to the back and forth conditions, that does the same. And usually people do this by contradiction. So here we assume that S and T are bisimilar, but there is a successor of S that is not bisimilar to any of the finitely many successors of T. By the way, this proof works only for finite models. So there must be a series of differentiating formulas between that successor and each of the T successors. And then we form the conjunction of all these formulas. And it turns out that we receive a contradiction because one of the two bisimilar states has to verify the diamond of this conjunction and the other does not. Now, I think that it is clear that this is a proof technique that we cannot use in the truthmaker context because the differentiating formulas might differ in more than one way. The fact that a left-hand side state verifies some phi I and the other doesn't exactly tell us what the other does to it. It could falsify it or it could neither verify nor falsify it. So it's actually, it doesn't work for if we want to create a differentiating formula for the states at the root, which in Truthmaker Semantics would be at the top. But we shouldn't lose hope, I believe, and rather divide and conquer in order to deal with non-classical negation here. And the way I've found useful towards that end is to invoke a notion of simulations, which is due to Courtonina and Dereke from the late 90s, which is a variant of bisimulation that is weakened and one-directional. So, like the existence of a simulation actually amounts to a criterion for when a pointed model satisfies all model formulas of another model and possibly more. So the atomic harmony condition, as you see in the definition, has now become a mere atomic inclusion condition. And instead of having a back and forth double condition on successors, we have only one back condition. So this, in a sense, reduces the task of showing invariances, because now invariance comes down to the existence of a pair of simulations from the left-hand side to the right-hand side and from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. And for the truthmaker context, our task has also been reduced. We should find now how MS has to be related to M prime S prime, so that M prime S prime verifies and falsifies all formulas verified and falsified by MS, and possibly more. And then we will be able to generalize and say that invariance will come down to the existence of a pair of simulations. So the definition that seems to work from what I've tried out is the one I've listed here, and it consists of two clauses. A relation R from MS to M prime S prime is a simulation just in case we have this first atomic inclusion condition holding. And then if we have this preservation of suprema clause from MS to M prime S prime. And it is, in a sense, unsurprising that these are the two relevant conditions, because given the recursive clauses of the most straightforward common propositional variety of Truthmaker semantics that I'm working with, we need just the atomic symbols and the suprema to retrieve the truth values of the connectives. So here's the proposition and it is that there is a simulation R from a finite Truthmaker model. The result concerns finite models to another, just in case the latter verifies and falsifies all formulas respectively verified and falsified by MS. And in one direction, the proof is an induction on formulas. And as I mentioned, since the conditions of the simulation mirror everything we need in the recursive clauses of Truthmaker semantics, this actually works neatly and rather quickly. I've listed two of the clauses here for demonstration. And in the reverse direction, we assume that for any phi, we have this verification and falsification of every of phi by MS, just in case. No, wrong. By M prime S prime, just in case it's verified or falsified by MS, and then we define R to be that very relation of verification and falsification of all these formulas. And we try to show that this is a simulation. So the first condition holds automatically by assumption. And to see that the second condition holds, we take some S in MS and being the supremum of states T and U, and we need to show that there must be some T prime U prime so that S prime is their supremum. To do so, I mentioned here this notion of non-trivial verification, but this is just a way of saying that when I count the formulas that will be verified and falsified by these states, I will not want to count P and P as a result of S verifying P, let's say, because S is the supremum of itself and itself. So let's suppose we have such a triad, S being the supremum of T and U, and take the straightforward case where T and U verify finitely many statements in this non-trivial way, and then we take their conjunctions, the AN and beta M respectively. So then, since every state is the supremum of itself and itself, T has to verify the whole conjunction, and U will have to verify the whole conjunction too, and therefore their supremum will have to verify the conjunction of these two conjunctions. And then, by our supposition, we know that S prime would also have to verify that conjunction of conjunctions, and again, possibly more things. So by the semantic clause, we infer that there must be states T prime and U prime that respectively verify each of the conjuncts. And we can actually generalize this if we want to allow for states that verify infinitely many atomic statements by taking arbitrarily chosen conjunctions of statements and arguing in a pigeonhole manner, since we're working with finite models. So given this, we can now generalize and say that there is a pair of simulations from MS to M prime S prime and back, just in case MS and M prime S prime verify and falsify the same formulas of a propositional language. It is still an open question, and I don't know how to answer it, whether this pair of simulations could actually come down to a variety of bisimulation, or whether that would be the case for certain kinds of truthmaker semantics once we add more restrictions and specifics. But the corollary of this is that if we have a simulation, then we get something like the bisimulation related condition on successors for the parts of states. We will need to have parts of states simulating one another as well. Now, there is a note, though, that my beloved mentor, Johan van Bentham, helped me realize in this result, that there is something strange with conjunction going on. When we created that conjunction by collecting one by one the statements verified by state T, let's say, we took them one by one and put them next to one another. And employing the reflexivity of the parthood relation, and that every state is the supremum of itself and itself, we concluded that the whole conjunction should be verified by that state. And this matches the classical Boolean notion of conjunction. However, the truthmaker semantic clause for conjunction is not the Boolean one of the classical type, but rather it's one that comes down to the existence of a pair of which that state is the supremum. And in fact, it is possible to have a state S that verifies a conjunction of alpha and beta without itself verifying any of the individual conjuncts, as in this example. Why this is relevant here? Because when we reason with simulations, also in the context of a proof, we might have the two being clustered together. So, because a simulation actually preserves both the notion of conjunctions of how formulas can be added in parallel, conjuncted in parallel, and the notion of this interactive truthmaker notion of conjunctions. And since we have allowed that the state that simulates another state might actually verify more statements, it could be that this neat distinction that we had breaks down, and there is no guarantee that the simulation will preserve these two in their separate forms. Now, I don't know whether this is a problem or not, and I suspect that it depends on what application one wants for the framework. But I have just listed here like two suggestions that I've come up with on how one could deal with this in principle, again, depending on the application. First, we could add more nuance and introduce new syntactical resources and have a distinct symbol in our syntax for classical Boolean conjunction, and another one for conjunction from the interaction of state parts, like this synthetic notion of interactive conjunction. And in a sense, one can detect both notions of conjunction in our thinking in natural language. For example, we might say that perceiving purple is perceiving blue and red. But this means that we are perceiving blue and red in this interactive sense, not that we are perceiving blue and red, the one next to the other. An alternative would be to introduce less nuance and move to inexact truthmaker semantics, where actually we don't have this kind of breakdown and this divergence. So if a state inexactly verifies a conjunction, then it means that it inexactly verifies each of the conjuncts. That would make things less fine-grained, but if we wanted to start from somewhere in our endeavor to introduce invariance-based thinking, that could be viewed as an argument for starting with inexact semantics, and then viewing exact truth making as the exact fragment of it. Any suggestions welcome here, or thoughts? So now I would like to close with some of the philosophical implications that I consider this general program to have. Again, as I mentioned, I've encountered some suspicion in discussions towards the framework, and that I gather results from this impression that we are doing metaphysics when we are actually using these tools, and we just presuppose that there are states as worldly entities, and we carve up reality in fundamental ways and so on. But I want to say that there is nothing in the logic that actually dictates that there is a single state space for any application or so. It's, of course, in principle possible to individuate states in alternative ways, and then we are allowed, and I think we should, start reasoning about the interrelations between these alternative individuations. Of course, this is not to say that there are no privileged individuations of states, but there is nothing in the logic that should suggest that, and I think we should offer arguments of a distinctively philosophical scope to that end. And on top of all these, and as a demonstration case, I wanted to make some, again, programmatic suggestions of how this whole invariance-based thinking could be applied to subject matter, which is the aboutness-laden domain par excellence. So far in the literature, we've seen explications of subject matter in the sense from above. We presuppose that there are statements and a conversation, and that subject matters are either partitions of logical space or maximal states in the inclusive variety of truthmaker semantics. But with simulations, we can actually take a step forward, and without sacrificing any of this very nice apparatus that we have in place, actually extend the framework towards something more communication-oriented, or from the interlocutor's point of view. Once we have a notion like simulations, we can pose the question of what do I have to assume about your subject matter, your state spaces and their respective mereology, and what your states do in terms of verification and falsification, so that we're talking about the same thing. And I think that in both of the dominant approaches on subject matter in terms of truth makers, both in Stephen Yablow's approach that truth makers induce M cells in the Lewisian direction, or in Kit Fine's suggestions that we have maximal states, the fusion of all verifiers and falsifiers in the context of inclusive semantics, then again, we can view the existence of a pair of simulations as two speakers inducing the same partition of logical space, or actually having maximal states that simulate one another, And then on top of that, we might be able to have a story about this common case that sometimes we might be in a conversation and one of us has a much broader conception of what the subject matter is than the other. For example, you might be claiming that Brahms is greater than Dvorak, and I'm disagreeing with you. And so far, we've been comparing only the relative merits of their symphonies. And at some point, you say, yes, but Dvorak's chamber music is not nearly as thoughtful. But then I'm puzzled because I thought that it was only symphonies that we were talking about. So in a sense, you took the subject matter to be Brahms or Dvorak, greater composer, whereas I took it to be Brahms or Dvorak, greater symphonic composer. And my subject matter is included in yours in the familiar subject matter mereology sort of way. But in terms of truth makers, we can now say that there is a simulation from each of my truth-making states to yours, but not in the reverse direction. There are verifiers and falsifiers in your model that make more statements true or false than mine. For example, Brahms's piano quintet is superior to either Dvorak's, and so on. So in a sense, having one-directed simulations could actually be employed towards ends like this. Of course, there are nuances on how to do that. I believe that if we adopt something like the maximal account, we might impose a restriction that an impossible state doesn't end up simulating a possible one. But overall, I think that this is a fruitful direction to pursue. So let me conclude very quickly. I started with a logical problem inspired by a widespread way of thinking that logicians exhibit. How must truth maker models be related so that they verify and falsify the same formulas? I said that a good starting point would be this connection to certain modal logics and their possible world models, where invariances are already well studied. And then it seems that one-directed simulations prove fruitful. First, we articulate what it takes for M prime, S prime to verify and falsify all formulas verified and falsified by MS respectively, and possibly more. And then we generalize the result for a pair of simulations. Then there are open questions, for example, whether we could prove the result for a bisimulation, and actually there is some hope here because there are non-classical logics like intuitionistic logic that in fact exhibit invariance under a kind of bisimulation. And then there is the conjunction problem where we have this clustering of the two notions that might, for certain applications, matter. And finally, I concluded by making a few programmatic suggestions that the framework being enriched with invariance-based thinking could actually help us extend the ongoing discussion about aboutness from above, as I characterized it, towards more communication-oriented perspectives. So that's it, and I would be very excited to hear your thoughts and feedback. Thank you.